So Fractal Design have just released two new versions. They're smaller versions of their very popular Meshify 2. So there's a Meshify 2 Mini, which is designed for micro ITX motherboards, and the version that I've got here, the Meshify 2 Nano, designed for ITX motherboards. So in this video, I'm going to be taking a really detailed look at the Meshify 2 Nano. So the Meshify 2 Nano is available from today in two different colours, black and white. In terms of MSRP, I'm recording this well before launch, so I don't have those details to hand, but once I do, I'll add them to the description. So it's great to see Fractal's toolless top latching mechanism for securing the side panels has continued over into the Meshify 2 Nano. So removing the side panels is really straightforward. They simply pull away at the top and can then be lifted away. Taking a look at our front I/O, we've got a separate headphone and microphone jack, a single USB Type-C port, a power and reset button, and two USB 3.0 Type-A ports. To remove the top panel, it's just simply a matter of pushing it up from the back and then it can be lifted away. Beneath the top panel, we've got a nylon dust filter which can be pulled backwards and then lifted away. The top of the case is removable. It's held on with two screws at the front, and once these have been removed, the top panel can simply be lifted up and away, which is going to be great, giving you plenty of access during the build. At the bottom of the case, we've got another full-length nylon dust filter, which can simply be pulled out from the front, and great to see that this can be done with the front panel still in place. Similar to the other versions of the Meshify 2, the front panel is actually a door. If you pull the Fractal logo, you're able to open it up. The door itself is removable by simply pulling it forward. And if we take a look at the back of it, you'll see we've got a full-length nylon dust filter, which can simply be pulled out from the top. So Fractal is giving you the option here of going with just mesh at the front or going with mesh and dust filter. The rest of the front panel can simply be removed by pulling forward. Moving into the main body of the case, and the Meshify 2 Nano will accommodate both mini ITX and mini DTX motherboards. In terms of fan mounting locations, at the front of the case you can mount either two 140 or two 120mm fans, and there is one dynamic X2 GP14 fan pre-installed. At the top of the case, it's up to two 120 or one 140mm fan, and the 140mm fan does need to be mounted towards the front of the case, and only a slim 15mm thick fan will fit. At the rear of the case, it's up to a 120mm fan, and there's a dynamic X2 GP12 fan pre-installed. In terms of radiator support, at the front of the case, you can fit up to a 280mm radiator, although it is going to be limited to 316mm in length and 146mm in width. At the top of the case, it's up to a 240mm radiator. It needs to be less than 121mm in width. If you do mount a radiator at the top, you're going to have to take care that your RAM and the height of your CPU cooler is less than 38mm. At the rear of the case, you can mount a 120mm radiator of less than 121mm in width. And if you are thinking about going with a custom loop, you'll be pleased to see there's some slots over to the right hand side of the motherboard for mounting a pump and reservoir. If you prefer to go with an air cooler, you should be able to fit a pretty large air cooler in the Meshify 2 Nano with a maximum height for CPU coolers of 167mm. Taking a look at the rear of the case, you'll see we've got two horizontal PCI expansion slot covers, although the case will accommodate graphics cards up to 2.8 slots or a maximum thickness of 58mm. In terms of GPU length, it's up to 306mm with the front fan installed, or up to 331mm if you remove the front fan. Taking a closer look at the bottom towards the front of the case, you'll notice that we've got a two-part modular air duct, which is designed to improve airflow towards the GPU and also improve compatibility for radiators and fans at the front of the case. With both parts of the air duct in place, there's up to 28mm of space at the front of the case for fans. If you remove half of the air duct, that space increases to 72mm, while removing it all means you've got 138mm of space at the front of the case for fans and radiators. Moving into the rear compartment, it's great to see that we've got rubber grommets over the two main cutouts to the right hand side of the motherboard, and also in the main body of the case there's a nice rubber grommet down at the bottom for the GPU cables to come through. It's also great to see that we've got plenty of Velcro cable straps, and in terms of cable routing space, it's between 15 and 25mm. Over to the left hand side of the case, we've got a dedicated 2.5-inch drive mounting bracket, which can be removed by simply loosening the thumb screw. The orientation of this bracket can be changed from vertical to horizontal, And the reason you may want to do that is going to mean you're going to be able to fit 2 of the drive brackets at the back of the case, and there is an additional one in the case accessory box. If you prefer, you can mount that additional bracket in the main body of the case below the GPU. The power supply is going to go down at the bottom of the case, and the Meshify 2 Nano is compatible with full-sized ATX power supplies up to a maximum length of 165mm with the hard drive cage installed, or up to 200mm with the hard drive cage removed. It's also great to see we've got a removable bracket to help installing the power supply, so you are going to be able to install it directly in from the back. At the bottom of the case, we've got a single drive tray which can accommodate either a 2.5-inch or 3.5-inch drive, or one of each. The position of this drive tray is adjustable. There's 4 screws at the bottom of the case, and if you loosen these, the drive tray can be slid into the desired position before retightening the screws. Alternatively, the drive cage can be removed by fully removing the screws and then simply lifting it away. One of the reasons you may want to remove the drive cage, as with it removed you can mount a 120mm fan at the bottom of the case. So what I want to do now is give you a look at the build I put together in the Meshify 2 Nano. So in the build I put together, we had an i7-12700K being cooled with a 240mm AIO at the front set to intake. For the graphics card, I used NVIDIA's RTX 3060 Ti. For fans, I used 6 Lian AL120 unifans, so there was 3 intake fans, 2 on the radiator at the front and 1 at the bottom, and we had 3 exhaust fans, 2 at the top and 1 at the rear. So taking a look at the temperatures, our CPU idled at 29 degrees and reached a maximum of only 71 degrees during a 10-minute IDA64 stability test. Our 3060 Ti idled at 31 degrees and reached a maximum of 73 degrees during the stability test. In terms of noise levels, these were also pretty good, with average noise levels of 35 decibels at idle and 42 decibels under load. So some really impressive numbers in terms of temperature and noise, and by far the best temperatures I've got with this CPU in any mini ITX build, although it is fair to say this is a pretty large mini ITX case. So the next thing I wanted to take a look at was, did removing the dust filters at the front and the top affect the temperatures? So taking a look at the results, the only difference was our GPU was 1 degree hotter, both at idle and under load. And in terms of noise levels, there was 1 decibel less noise under load. So that's great news. The dust filters that Fractal use in this case are of really high quality, so you're going to be able to have a PC that's both free from dust and running cool. The other thing I noticed with the front dust filter installed, the front of the case looked much cleaner because it slightly blocked the view of the radiator with the dust filter on compared to having it off. So the next thing that I wanted to look at was, did the single intake fan at the bottom actually improve temperatures? So removing the fan at the bottom made absolutely no difference to our CPU temperatures, both at idle and under load, while our GPU temperatures increased by 1 degree at idle and 2 degrees under load. There was no significant difference to the noise levels. With the fan removed, they were 1 decibel louder at idle and 1 decibel quieter under load. So it does seem that having a fan at the bottom set to intake does improve the GPU temperatures, although that is going to come at an extra cost. 1, you're going to have to purchase an additional fan. 2, you're going to have the headache of trying to plug an extra fan into the single system fan header that comes with most mini ITX motherboards. But I think the biggest headache that you're going to have is in terms of cable management. I had to be really particular with the cables down at the bottom of the case so that there was space for the fan and none of the cables were going to fall into it. And that's normally where I would just push all the cables in and not worry too much about them. So if you do go with a fan at the bottom, you're going to have to pay much more attention to your cable management to allow the fan to actually fit. So you're going to have to weigh all that up to decide whether you think having a fan at the bottom is worth it or not. The other thing that I wanted to look at was removing the other half of the front air duct. I had to remove half of it to fit the radiator and fans at the front, and I wanted to see if I removed the second half, did that affect the temperatures? So taking a look at the results, in terms of temperatures at idle, the only difference was our GPU ran 1 degree hotter with the air duct removed, while under load our CPU ran 2 degrees hotter and our GPU was 1 degree hotter. It was the opposite story in terms of noise levels, with the noise levels coming down by 1 decibel both at idle and under load by removing the air duct. So it does seem that the air duct does work in terms of reducing temperatures. The other thing that it does is it makes the build look much cleaner, because when you removed it, you just had a big hole at the front of the case, which definitely didn't look as good. Next thing I want to look at was, are the top fans essential? So I removed the top 2 fans, keeping everything else the same. Taking a look at the results, with the top two fans removed, our CPU idled 2 degrees hotter, and it was 4 degrees hotter during the AIDA64 stability test. GPU temperatures were also hotter by 4 degrees, both at idle and under load. And in terms of noise levels, the only difference was a 1 decimal reduction in the idle noise levels with the top fans removed. So the results here are fairly clear. The fans at the top make a massive difference. So if you are going for a similar build, I would strongly recommend putting extra fans at the top. The next thing I wanted to do was take a look at air cooling, and with a CPU cooler height of up to 167mm supported, the great news was that Be Quiet's Dark Rock Pro 4, which is my favourite air cooler, was going to fit. To get it to fit in the case, I was going to have to change the motherboard because the STRIX motherboard that we have was so built up that you can't really fit an air cooler on it, and that's a big problem for a lot of Z690 mini ITX motherboards. The one I used was from BioStar, and it was their B660 GTN, and you can fit a large premium air cooler with it. So in terms of the rest of the setup, I put the fans that came with the case back in their original location, and I added a Pure Wings to 140mm fan set to intake at the top above the Fractal fan. Taking a look at the results with the air cooler, our CPU idled 7 degrees hotter, and it was a whopping 29 degrees hotter during the AIDA64 stability test. And important to note, there was up to 8% thermal throttling during that test with the air cooler, and obviously none with the AIO. In terms of GPU temperatures, there wasn't really a significant difference, with the air cooler being 1 degree hotter at idle and 1 degree cooler under load. It was the opposite story in terms of noise, with the air cooler being 4 decibels quieter at idle and 1 decibel quieter under load. So the results here really do speak for themselves. If you're going with a high-end build with a powerful CPU, you'd be much better going with an AIO at the front set to intake. I was expecting the GPU temperature to be significantly worse with this configuration, but was pleasantly surprised to find that they weren't. And in fact, really, the only reason to go with an air cooler would be noise. The build with the Dark Rock Pro 4 was incredibly quiet. The figures themselves don't do it justice, because actually there's a big difference in the quality of the noise with the air cooler compared to the pump on the AIO, and you really can notice the difference. So if you're looking for noise, or you're going for a less powerful build, the air cooler would work really well. It's a really straightforward build to do. But if you want the best possible temperatures, I would recommend the AIO at the front. Although it is possible to fit up to 280mm AIO at the front, I'm not sure how well that would fit with fans mounted at the top. It was something I didn't try, but it was a little bit tight, particularly getting the tubes and the radiator fitted in with the 240, and I had to move it down a bit from its original location. So I'm not sure a 280mm radiator would fit at the front with fans at the top, and we know from the thermal testing you're definitely going to want fans at the top. So my recommendation for building in this case would definitely be with an AIO at the front set to intake. Probably have the 2 fans at the top, have the rear exhaust, but I would probably leave the fan out at the bottom, and that's going to really simplify the cable management. So this brings me on to my experience of building in the Meshify 2 Nano, and the build I put together didn't go completely smoothly. So the first and most important thing to point out is that you are going to want to pass your EPS cable up through the cutout at the top left hand side of the case before installing your motherboard, because once you've installed your motherboard, you're not going to be able to fit the cable through the cutout. The motherboard slightly blocks the cable cutout. So I did do that, but what I didn't do was pass the rear fan cable also through that cutout. And the problem is, once you've got your motherboard in and the cable plugged in to the EPS connector at the top of the motherboard, you couldn't actually fit the fan cable through the case as well. So I would go a step further than the recommendations Fractal make in the manual, and as well as just plugging the EPS cable through that cutout, you're also going to want to pass the rear fan cable through the cutout as well before installing the motherboard. Now, one other area that I got into difficulties with was using an SFX power supply. The reason for using it is I wanted to test whether having a fan at the bottom really made any difference in terms of temperatures. And to do that, I thought having an SFX power supply without any cable extensions would give me the best chance of having plenty of space at the bottom. Downside to that was the Seasonic power supply that I used, the cables weren't long enough to reach the motherboard. Both the EPS cable and the 24-pin cable. and I ended up needing to use cable extensions. So now we know from my thermal testing that you don't actually save that much in terms of temperatures by having that fan at the bottom. I would strongly recommend going with an ATX power supply without any cable extensions, and the build is going to be so much easier. Although I was able to manage the cable extensions at the back fairly well and had no difficulty getting the side panel back on again, credit to Fractal for the job they did with where they had put those Velcro cable straps and the space that they had in the right places. I did have some problems with the cable extensions at the top of the case and getting the top panel back on again. And the cable extensions did interfere with the fans at the top of the case, meaning I had to install them further towards the front than what I would have intended to. So a few other things to point out if you were thinking of doing a slightly different build. The I/O that I used, I did try sizing it up at the top and it wouldn't actually fit. The motherboard's I/O shield is quite bulky and you couldn't actually get the radiator pushed back enough to be able to install it, even with it all the way at the front of the case. So the other thing, it didn't look great at the top because it sat very far down over the motherboard and the temperatures would likely be worse than having it at the front. So I wouldn't recommend using a radiator at the top in this case. So this brings me on to the things I liked about the Meshify 2 Nano, and there is an awful lot that I liked about it. I think firstly, it's a great looking case. Secondly, it has exceptional build quality as you would expect with Fractal. They've really just scaled down the Meshify 2 and kept all its premium features like the toolless top latching mechanisms, the multitude of air filters, high quality air filters that it has, and I like this. A lot of trends for new cases are they're removing these and just going with the mesh, and I think Fractal have got it right. They're giving people the choice of whether they want to put them in and not offering them as an optional extra. In terms of having the rubber grommets over the cutouts, I really like these, and particularly the one in the main body of the case at the front of the case. And this works so much better, meaning the cable can run directly down to the power supply compartment rather than having to go through the back of the case, which is really going to help with cable management and as well making it look much cleaner. I also thought the case was really well thought out. Having the ability to remove the top panel really made the building process so much easier. Having that two-part duct actually helped improve the temperatures, but also hit all the cables at the bottom as well. And all the cable management at the back worked really flawlessly. So this brings me on to the things that I didn't like about the Meshify 2. And in reality, there's very little to say here. I did find it a little bit more fiddly to build in than the Torrent Nano, although getting the motherboard screwed in was so much easier with the large air cooler in place. I really struggled with that in the Torrent Nano and couldn't get the top left screw into place, but the fact that the top panel comes off in this case means there was no problem at all doing that with my air-cooled build. But there was a few issues with cable extensions at the top and getting the rear fan cable through. But I think if you know these and you're prepared for them, there shouldn't be that much of an issue. The case on paper seems to offer a whole variety of cooling configurations, but in reality, you're limited to just a few, I think. I don't think a radiator at the top is really a good option with an AIO for the reasons that we've already mentioned. And I think you're really between having an air cooler or a radiator at the front for most people in terms of building in the case. Another slight gripe I have is with the type of fans that Fractal included in the case. Not that the fans don't look good or they run cool and quiet, because they certainly do all of those, but the slight issue I have is the type of connectors on the fans. I much prefer 4-pin PWM connectors, and they're definitely a more premium feel. And given that this is a premium case, it was a little bit disappointing that the fans included had 3-pin connectors that you're going to have to run in DC mode. Another slight gripe I have again relates to the fans. In this case, you can fit up to 6 system fans, and as it's an ITX case, most ITX motherboards only have a single fan header for system fans. And in fact, the case comes with 2 fans included, and already you're going to have to add a splitter cable to plug them into the single system fan header on your mini ITX motherboard. So the point I'm getting at, I would love Fractal to have included a fan hub at the back of the case, and it would just really have simplified the build, because the average user is almost certainly going to have to go out and pick up some splitter cables to do a build in the case. So I absolutely love what Fractal have done with the Meshify 2 Nano. I was a big fan of their original Meshify 2, so it's great to have a smaller version of it should you want a smaller footprint on the desk for your PC. I thought both the builds I put together in it looked absolutely stunning, and I would be really happy with either of them sitting on my desk. So I suppose the big question is now, given the Fractal have already got a really good mini ITX case in the Torrent Nano, is this one better? I think it really depends on what your own personal preference is in terms of the aesthetics. I think they're both stunning cases, but personally I do think the Torrent Nano looks slightly better. It is important to say the Torrent Nano will be slightly bigger, so this one will have a smaller footprint on your desk, and the GPU temperatures in the Torrent Nano with the bottom intake are going to be slightly better, whereas your power supply temperatures in this case are going to be slightly better. It's going to have an intake at the bottom, and the GPU temperatures will be a little bit worse. In terms of building in the case, this one is a little bit more tricky than the Torrent Nano if you're going with an AIO. Although with an air cooler, this one is a little bit easier because the top panel comes off and you don't have the power supply at the top. So they both have their individual advantages and disadvantages, and I think you just have a look at the two of them and decide which you like the best, because they're both really good cases. So if you do like the look of the Meshify 2 Nano, I can completely recommend going out and getting it. And if you are thinking of doing so, I've already made a full step-by-step build guide to building in the case, and you're definitely going to want to check that out. You'll find a link to that video in the description. So if you have enjoyed this video, please remember to give it a thumbs up. And if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching.